Hello, this is Tim Congdon. I'm Chairman of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. The Institute exists to increase understanding of the relationship between economic policy and then wider economic outcomes, employment, inflation, and so on. And our aim is to increase knowledge and improve policy making. What I'm about to say may have implications for financial markets and indeed for business decisions. But we have no responsibility for that. Fine, I want to talk with this is the beginning of 2017 and there's much concern about the Trump presidency in the United States. A widely held view is that there's going to be more infrastructure spending, which will lead to a so-called easing of fiscal policy, and that this will then lead to higher growth in the United States in 2017 and indeed help the world economy as a whole. So the current pattern is for the international organizations, the IMF, the OECD and so on, to raise their growth forecasts for 2017, perhaps even for 2018, and this to some extent is being followed by other forecasters around the world. I want to cast some doubt on these ideas. So Donald Trump is going to arrange for $1,000 billion of extra spending over 10 years. All right. Well, American gross domestic product, American GDP, is $18,000 billion. Now, if you divide 1,000 billion by 10, you get 100 billion, which compares with 18,000. It's about 0.6%, even if it gets through Congress, even if it's additional to what's already being spent under current plans. But suppose that Donald Trump were in fact to increase the budget deficit relative to other plans, relative to existing arrangements, so that there would be what is called expansionary fiscal policy. Would this lead to faster growth of demand, output and employment in the United States? And obviously, because the USA is one of the world's two big economies, that would indeed matter to the rest of the world. But would it have this effect? Now, there have been many debates about this topic in the last 60, 70 years, going all the way back to John Maynard Keynes' 1936 classic General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which is usually regarded as the beginning of the current argument for fiscal policy, which turns on the idea that people spend money, that then becomes demand, that becomes output, that then becomes incomes, people spend their incomes, that becomes demand, and so on. And if the state spends more, then this is in addition to total expenditure, helps employment. And the text was just take it for granted, the Keynesian textbook was just take it for granted that an expansionary fiscal policy is positive for demand, output and employment. And I was struck by a piece in the Daily Telegraph on 16th of January by Roger Bootle, where he says the Great Recession a few years ago weakened public finances, and the policymakers reacted by a so-called loosening of policy in 2009. Then the budget deficits widened out, and they cut public spending, they raised taxes, and so there was a tightening of policy after this, beginning say 2011, 2012. And this tightening fiscal policy had the effect of weakening demand despite propaganda about expansionary fiscal contraction. Now, this phrase, expansionary fiscal contraction, it's been described by Larry Summers, the American Treasury Secretary, as an oxymoron. It goes back to a paper published in 1990 by two Italian economists, Giovazzi and Pagano, where they looked at the experience of some small European countries that, in order to comply with international payments obligations, pressure from the International Monetary Fund and so on, had reduced their budget deficits in the 1980s and then had economic recoveries, so that apparently there'd been fiscal restraint, fiscal contraction, yet the economies had good growth. Okay, expansionary fiscal contraction, completely in defiance of the Keynesian textbooks. Now, who's right about this matter? And is it the case that expansionary fiscal contraction is an oxymoron, like Larry Summers said? Is it the case that anybody who puts out this idea is guilty of spreading propaganda, as Roger Bootle asserts? Well, I believe we should look at evidence. And I prepared an article about the American numbers, which appeared in the journal Economic Affairs in early 2015, a couple of years ago now, where I showed that while the relationship between fiscal policy and demand wasn't very clear, which by itself, by the way, is a real problem for the Keynesians, since for quite a long period of time, from 1990 up to 2014, in America, on average, when the government reduced the budget deficit, the economy grew at an above trend rate. When it raised the budget deficit, it grew at a beneath trend rate. Okay. Keynesian textbooks all wrong. Fiscal contraction was expansionary, fiscal expansion was contractionary. And indeed I could, let's just run through some of this evidence, shall we? Before I do that, let me just say that we've now, just think about the background to all this. We've had the small European economies mentioned by Giovazzi and Pagano. We also had a big debate in Britain in the early 1980s. The 1981 budget took action to reduce the budget deficit in the middle of a recession, and then was roundly condemned by no less than 364 British economists who wrote a letter to the Times in protest. The economy recovered within a few weeks of the 1981 budget, and indeed had much above trend growth in the late 1980s. So the letter from all these economists was wrong in detail. I mean, there's a controversy about it, and you could look it up and discuss it. I've had an exchange about it with Stephen Nicol. Again, it's a question of evidence. We had another episode of all this kind of thing at the end of 2012 in America. The Americans had indeed eased fiscal policy in 2008 and 2009 to deal with the then looming Great Recession. Didn't stop the Great Recession, by the way. Then to get public debt back under control, they had to raise taxes, withdraw the previous tax cuts, and that then meant that in prospect for 2013 was a big reduction in the budget deficit. Keynesians said, this is a fiscal cliff. Disaster's coming up in 2013 if the government doesn't cancel these tax increases. There was some reduction in the tax increases, but basically went ahead. There was a large reduction in the budget deficit, and the economy was fine. Okay, so you've now had lots and lots of episodes of this sort. 81 budget in the UK, all of those small European countries in the 1980s, the American fiscal cliff, 2012, 2013. Okay. Let's look at some of the numbers I looked at when I prepared that article for Economic Affairs in 2015. What I'm using here is a database from the International Monetary Fund. These data are not mine. I haven't in any sense kind of doctored or mangled or manipulated these data. I'm just giving you the numbers as the IMF itself has prepared them. They show you the change in output relative to trend. There's the blue line here. And then the change in the budget deficit. Notice that, the budget deficit. Now, if the Keynesians were right, what there should be here is a, when deficit goes up, it's above trend growth, deficit goes down, that's beneath trend growth, yeah? Okay. That's what's supposed to happen. Let's look at reality. Is there a pattern here? There's no pattern here. There's no relationship at all. Well, let's look a bit harder. What I'm going to do now is to cut out the 1980s. I know I'm cheating a bit, fair enough. I'm just trying to look at evidence. Okay. I'm going to cut out the 1980s because I don't dispute that in the early 1980s, President Reagan did increase the budget deficit, and 1983 and 84 there was a strong recovery in the US economy from the recession of 80-81. Let's just look then at this period from 1990 until today. Instead of, this chart is of growth and the deficit, I'm going to look at growth and the budget balance. Okay? There's a relationship here, apparently. In other words, when the budget balance improves, when fiscal policy is being tightened, the American economy enjoys above trend growth. Okay. Now this is not supposed to happen. You can prepare, just using, I'm not a statistician, but you can prepare a least squares regression for this data, and you get an equation that's all right. Not brilliant, but it's okay. All right? There is a sort of relationship here, and it's the exact opposite of what the Keynesians think is possible. But it's not propaganda. This is facts. Right? This isn't made up. This is data from the IMF. Yes, I've worked on the data. I haven't manipulated the data. It's as the data actually are. Okay. Let's move back to the UK, where one would expect Roger Bootle to be, better informed and to understand what's actually fact. Again, what's actually true. Now, again, I'm going to show you the picture for 1980 until today. There's no worthwhile relationship here. The coefficient, there is actually a coefficient, a positive coefficient on the, if you regress the change in the output gap on the change in the budget balance, not the deficit, on budget balance, you actually do get a positive coefficient, and you shouldn't get that. But I'm not going to exaggerate that. Basically, there's no relationship here. Actually, fiscal policy doesn't work. All right. But let's then again look at a shorter period, and again I'm going to cut out some of the numbers. I'm going to cut all the numbers up till 2007. Okay, and then this is what I get. And again, what I've done here is to look at the change in the output gap against the change in the balance, not the deficit. And lo and behold, I get a very nice relationship. when you get an easing of fiscal policy, when the deficit rises, you get poor economic growth. You got the Great Recession, in fact. Then there was fiscal austerity under the Conservatives from 2010. What's associated with above-trend growth? Now look, none of this is propaganda. This is just evidence. I'm surprised by it myself. I've never believed in using fiscal policy to manage demand. I'm sure you can find other periods where fiscal policy works in the way the Keynesian textbooks say it does. All I'm putting to you is that what all these people, Roger Bootle, Larry Summers, etc., Joe Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, what they say about this subject is wrong. And I'm not inventing the data, I'm not putting out propaganda, I'm going to the facts. All right? The question of why fiscal policy works, this is a very important one, and we economists must sort it out. But what we must do is check evidence before we start launching into statements of the kind that Roger Bootle had in the Daily Telegraph on Monday. So, when we come on to the question of the prospect for 2017, it is not at all true, it's not at all the case that if Donald Trump has these so-called expansionary fiscal policies, that means we should raise our growth forecast for 2017. Not at all. President Clinton in the 1990s reduced the budget deficit, told his own people in advance he was going to do so. He did reduce the budget deficit, and there was a good boom under President Clinton. Okay, let's watch this space. We don't know what's going to happen on the fiscal policy front in America. It's not relevant to world outlook in 2017 or 2018. Far more important is what's happening in the banking system and the rate of growth of the quantity of money. I'm going to finish here by saying that in the last few months, money growth in America has slowed down. The basic reason for this is the Federal Reserve has effectively been reversing the quantitative easing policies that it had from time to time from 2009 to 2013. I'm not going to ring a great alarm bell about this at this stage, but the lower rate of money growth since August, in fact, since August 2016, has been clearly defined, and if anything, for me, is one reason why we should expect somewhat slower growth in US demand in early 2017, but I wouldn't emphasize it too much at this stage. Thank you very much.